I'm Doug Dibbert, and on behalf of my colleagues at the University of North Carolina General Alumni Association, it's a delight to welcome each and every one of you. I understand that some of you didn't learn as early as I did that if you follow politics and elections, you really don't need to read novels. Or as someone else said, it's really quite difficult to make this stuff up. We have a forum that I think you'll find fascinating and interesting, and I suspect even the panelists will find fascinating and interesting as they listen to one another. And we're particularly delighted to have Leonida Inge as our moderator. Once our panelists have concluded, and I might add here that they've been very busy, and some have confided and confessed that they're a bit exhausted already for having spent the better part of the day talking about what happened yesterday. But we're going to dispense with lengthy introductions because you have their bios, and we want to save the time for their presentations. Once we have turned, or I've turned the podium over to Leonida, we're going to invite our presenters to actually make brief, and I'm defining brief, and they've been told how to define brief, 5 to 7 minutes, and we have some enforcers in the room that will remind them if they've gone too far over that. We will, at the conclusion of that, provide what we'll describe as a comfort break so that you will have that opportunity and you know it now. That doesn't mean you can't take one earlier, but just know that there is one that's planned. Many of you have provided questions in advance, and we have those, and those have been in turn passed along to Leonida. And others of you may be inspired to questions, and we have 3 by 5 cards, which I think were available as you arrived, and if you will, we will collect those during the break. So now it's my great pleasure to bring to the stage an award-winning journalist, better known to many of you as someone you hear regularly on WUNC's Changing Economy, the reporter Leonida Inge. Leonida?
Hello, I have my iPhone timer. And they were speaking about the 5 to 7 minutes. When I work in public radio, we know when people's attention span cuts off. Definitely at 5 minutes, 30 seconds. That's about it. But thank you, good evening. And I guess then welcome to the day after Super Tuesday. I guess we can call it, what's the deal Wednesday. We had a great, everybody's waiting for a big shakeup of some sort, and everybody's counting, how many states, candidates have won and tackled. I must say it's been an exciting but a very long political season, and as a journalist, I try to get away as hard as I can, but I can't get away because I always have the radio on and I'm always checking my email and I'm always on Facebook, and the only thing that people are posting is what happened, the day before, or who said this or who said that. Really, I like things short and sweet, so I really want November to get here really fast, and I'm sure you do too. And I think the latest bit of election news that I tried not to hear, I tried to ignore, but Ben Carson says now he's not going to be at the debate coming up tomorrow, but he won't say he's going to drop out. We're like, come on, give us something good to report. Not good, but something exciting to report, because there may be some Ben Carson fans out there. That's what I like about being a journalist and a registered non-affiliated reporter. So no one could ever say They know how they think I'm going to vote. I'm non-affiliated. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't watch the debates. I just read the transcripts afterwards. I want a real educated choice to help me have a very educated choice. And I'm very actually excited. Some people on the panel I've met before, and I guess in radio I'm not used to people looking at me at all. And so I'm used to talking to them on the phone and some folks in the audience. But now we hope to hear what they have to say about this political season and their take on everything. We're going to start closest to the podium, Mr. Guillory, and move on down. And yes, they'll move, instead of shifting back and forth, they'll shift the microphones back and forth. And just tell us a little bit about what they think so far so we can get started.
Well, thank you, Leonida. Nice to see all of you, friends.
Really?
Yeah. My role, as I understand it, is to talk a little bit about North Carolina and the South specifically, and let the folks to my left, wiser than I am, do the big picture. At a moment like this, I'm reminded of the 1924 Democratic Convention. All of you remember it, of course. H.L. Mencken, the iconoclast journalist, is sitting up in the rafters in the press gallery in New York watching the Democrats try to nominate a presidential candidate, ballot after ballot. Since you were there or watching it on TV, you know that it went beyond 100 ballots. At the 100th ballot, Mencken sent his story to Baltimore. He wrote for the Baltimore Sun that said the lead was, everything in this convention is uncertain except one thing. John W. Davis will never be nominated for President of the United States. On the 103rd ballot, one guy named John W. Davis was indeed nominated for President of the United States and shortly forgotten to history after that. Mencken turns to the guy next to him and says, I hope the idiots in Baltimore will know enough to strike out the negative. And ever since I heard that story, I've come to two conclusions: that newspaper editors, of which I used to be one, are the guys in charge of the negatives. And the other is that often you don't know what's going on in American politics when you're sitting there watching it. And so with that as a caution, let me say a couple of things just to get started. One is that I think as I think of the 2016 election, I think in terms of the 1968 election as a pivot point, and that's the election that was awfully close. Three candidates, Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, Richard Nixon, the Republican, and George Wallace as the American independent candidate. And Nixon won by barely half a percentage point. And that election stirred him, using Kevin Phillips' data, to come up with what was known as the Southern Strategy. And that Southern Strategy has played out over the years. It was fully implemented by Ronald Reagan after Watergate. And that, along with the Voting Rights Act and several other factors, led to a realignment or refocusing of the two major parties. And so, to some extent, the Trump phenomenon in the Republican Party is an outgrowth of half a century later of the shift of white, conservative, largely male former Democrats into the Republican Party. During the 1970s and 80s, we used to call them Jesse-crats, the Democrats who voted for Jesse Helms. Somebody asked me the other day what happened to the Jesse-crats, and I told them they're not crats anymore. They are the sons and daughters of the Jesse-crats, and they're fully Republican. And so North Carolina politics reflects, to a large extent, that reconfiguration of the two parties. As does the politics in a lot of other southern states. So now the question is looking ahead to this election, how does that play out? Well, I think in large part because of North Carolina's population growth and its increasing metropolitanization, particularly in the Charlotte metro area and the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Research Triangle area, that there is a stronger base of Democrats in North Carolina, along with Virginia and Florida, than there are in deep South states. For something else I was working on today, I looked up some election returns from 2012, and I looked at the lieutenant governor's race. So you get out of presidential politics and the governor's race, and just how do voters vote when they don't really know who the candidates are? Okay? The Republican candidate for lieutenant governor, Dan Forrest, who is the incumbent, got 2.187 million votes. The losing Democratic candidate, Linda Coleman, who is running against this year, got 2.181 million votes. 7,000 votes separated them out of 4.4 million cast. That's how divided North Carolina is. People vote their party. There are not many swing voters. Elections in this state have to do with turnout and mobilization. One last observation. In the 70s and 80s, even into the 90s, much of political punditry and attention was on state-level Democrats and how would they relate to presidential Democrats. So when candidates like Walter Mondale or Michael Dukakis or others of that sort would come into the state, everybody wanted to know, would the governor show up or not, you know. Well, now it's flipped. I think one of the big stories in this election is if Trump does survive to go into to become the Republican presidential candidate, or if some of the others, including Ted Cruz, does Pat McCrory show up? Does Richard Burr show up? And one of the fascinating facets, I think, of this campaign is that the dilemma that Democrats used to face 20 years ago, Republicans now face. Your turn.
Very interesting.
Thank you, Farrell, very much, and thanks all for coming out tonight. And if I could amplify a little bit on what Farrell said, if you look at the registration numbers in North Carolina still is a plurality Democrat state. I checked the numbers as of Saturday, 6.5 million registered voters in North Carolina, 41% Democrats, 31% Republicans, 28.5% unaffiliated, and 0.5% Libertarian. But in actual voting behavior, the state's really more like 44-44, with the remaining 12% up for grabs. Because if you look at a landslide statewide election, that would be if a winning Democrat or Republican got 55% of the vote or 56%. You rarely see a losing candidate get less than 44. That's very, very unusual. And that played out in 2012 in the Council of State races, where the two open seats were governor and lieutenant governor, which Pat McCrory won and then Dan Forrest won very narrowly. But in all the other races where there were incumbents running, it didn't matter if it was a Democrat or a Republican, they were all reelected, and they were reelected with similar percentages. So down ballot races, it's very difficult for one thing to dislodge a Council of State member in North Carolina who's running for reelection. And that's been, Elaine Marshall defeated Richard Petty for Secretary of State when she first won in 1996. So it was a very difficult thing to do. So what I want to talk about here briefly is how in 2010, which was a Republican wave year nationally, as 2006 and 2008 were Democratic wave years nationally, how did the General Assembly flip from, how did the state Senate go from 30 Democrats to 19 Democrats, and the General Assembly go from 67 Democrats to 52 Democrats, when the districts themselves were drawn by Democrats? The argument I would make is that organizations are important, and leadership is important, and candidates are important. What has happened over the years is that although North Carolina has been a functioning two-party state since 1972, it's taken basically 40 years for Republicans to build up candidates at the local level. They've done an active recruiting job at the local level to find people to run for school boards and county commissions and city councils and races like that to groom themselves for higher office eventually. It's a concentrated effort. Former Governor Jim Martin had a lot to do with that back in the late 1980s. When he won his second term as governor, he also invested a lot of money into local candidate building and that sort of thing. And so that took this gradually, because you have to remember, in 1972, when Jim Holshouser was elected governor, Democrats controlled 90% of the county government in North Carolina. Only right around 2010, maybe 2012, did Republicans pull even in local government. So it's taken a long time for that buildup to happen. And what I would argue is, to paraphrase or to, I guess, quote Woody Allen, 80% of life is showing up. And what happened in 2010 is that Republicans showed up at candidate filing time. I looked this up, that if you look at the 120 House districts that were all open in 2010, Republicans fielded candidates in 112 of them. Democrats let 19 of the 52 Republican House members run unopposed. And in the Senate, one Democrat incumbent ran unopposed, but 11 of the 20 Republican senators ran unopposed. So Republicans showed up. Some people who were elected were not ready for prime time. There's no question about that, but they were on the ballot. In a year that a lot of people were angry for various reasons, they chose to vote the bums out. That's what they did at that time. Since then, Republicans have made about, I think, as significant gains as they could possibly make in state government, given registration figures. And as you're probably aware of the redistricting issue, the fact is they've done all they can to squeeze every last vote out of all of these districts. But what happened was in 2010, they showed up at candidate filing time, they showed up at the polls, and they won. Now, what does this mean going forward? Well, what I see coming up in this 2016 election is that, as I think the Democratic Party statewide got a little bit complacent after the 2008 election, the Republican Party is getting a little complacent now, because you see 28 Democrats and 27 Republicans in the State House of Representatives are running unopposed. So they're not filing, they're not challenging each other in these races where they assume that the districts are safe. And so you will see more of a stagnant General Assembly until the next redistricting round, which may happen next year. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think my comments are going to build very nicely on what has come before, but I'm going to transition us a little bit to more of the national landscape. And I'm going to start by saying that as a political scientist, when we started looking at the presidential election coming up and the congressional elections coming up here in 2016, most of our predictions would have suggested a win for the Democratic Party. Now, by a very small margin, but most of our models would have suggested, given the fundamentals, meaning the state of the economy, President Obama's approval numbers, gasoline prices, all of these types of fundamentals would have pointed toward a minor victory for the Democratic Party at the presidential level come 2016. At the congressional level, we would have seen something fairly similar to that, with, of course, the House being controlled by the Republican Party currently, the Senate also controlled by the Republican Party. Given redistricting, we would not have expected Democrats to take over the House, but maybe pick up a few seats. And then in the Senate, where things are a little more volatile for some of the reasons that Rick mentioned, given the 2010 wave year for the Republican Party, there are a lot of Democrats who are overexposed in, Republicans, who are overexposed in seats in the Senate. So we would have expected the Democrats to pick up a few seats, in the United States Senate, but maybe not enough to flip majority control over to that party. Now, fast forward to 2016 and the beginning of the primary season at the presidential level, at least, and we're seeing a very different picture emerge. And I think as political scientists, we're still trying to get a grasp on exactly what that means, not just for the presidency, but from my perspective, even more importantly, at the congressional level. So, for instance, we now have Republicans in the House and in the Senate throughout the country who are saying, what does a Donald Trump nomination look like for me? And we're seeing the same thing if it's a Ted Cruz nomination. What does a Ted Cruz nomination look like for me? And building on some of the prior comments that were made, do I distance myself from my party? Do I stake out ground that is distinct from Donald Trump, that is distinct from Ted Cruz, or do I have to embrace the top of the ticket? What does the top of the ticket do for turnout? And these are questions that political scientists are really trying to grapple with, and I wouldn't say we have any good answers yet. We can look back to 1964, and we can think about what a Barry Goldwater campaign looked like, and we can make some analogies there. We can look back to 1968 on the Democratic side that was already mentioned, and we can make some comparisons there and say, what does a brokered convention look like for the Republicans? What's the effect of a brokered convention, even if the nominee that comes out is an establishment candidate? What's the effect of that down the ballot for House races, for Senate races? And I think it's going to be a really interesting year. We've already seen Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell say to members of the Senate who are in tough electoral contests, say, if you want to distance yourself from the top of the ticket, feel free. You have my permission to run ads against our nominee for president, should that nominee be a Donald Trump or even a Ted Cruz. And that's amazing. The separation of the party and the breaking apart of that top of the ticket and what that disarray in the party is going to mean for those races down the ballot. I'd add to that also a little more focus on the United States Senate and the fact that if we go back to 2010, which was really the first year of the Tea Party movement here in the United States, this is where we get the idea of the Republicans being overexposed. So this year on the United States Senate side, there are 24 seats that are up for re-election that are controlled by Republicans currently. There are only 10 for Democrats. So already we have a lot more Republicans potentially on their heels. And then when we look at those states, there's a lot of those states that are or have been controlled at the state level by Democrats in recent years, whether that's a governor race, the other senator from the state, the votes for Barack Obama in 2012 and 2008. And they all point to the fact that Democrats could do better in some of those states. States that come right off the top of my head here are Wisconsin, of course, Illinois, Pennsylvania. And in fact, we're even seeing some of the same elections we saw back in 2010, Wisconsin being a great example of this, between the current incumbent, Ron Johnson, who was a Tea Party candidate, and then the incumbent that he ousted in 2010, being, of course, Russ Feingold is back on the ballot this year. And so the response of how senators handle that and how they deal with the top of their ticket, what that means for ballot roll-off. If people come to vote to turn out, do they bother voting in lower-level elections if they're really only there to cast a vote for Trump? Or does that have a totally different effect? And I'm not sure, again, we have clear answers because this really is a new environment moving forward. Additionally, on the Senate side, we have the drama that is playing out with the Supreme Court vacancy. And this, I also think we cannot underestimate as to what the effect of that is going to be on some of those elections moving forward. So we're at complete deadlock with regards to the president and the Senate moving forward, as at least they all have stated their positions currently. And it'll be really interesting to see then what that means for these Senate elections. Our senators, and we've seen this in some cases in Pennsylvania as a great example, incumbent Toomey has said, we should hold hearings, again feeling threatened by his Democratic opponent in that state. But what is going to happen? How is this going to play out? How is that going to affect voter turnout? How is that going to affect how people decide to cast their ballots come election time? And I think, once again, indicators would be that we'll see McConnell simply say, we need to let the people speak, as he already has, and we'll let them speak here in 2016 in the next presidential election. And on the flip side, we're going to see Democrats say, well, the public has spoken, and this is just more of the same, gridlock that we've seen in the last few years. And what side of the argument the American electorate, especially given the data that Rick suggested even at the North Carolina level, but extending that to the national level, it really is a divided country. And we're seeing more and more people casting ballots along those party lines But all that is to say, what does that mean with a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz, a more insurgent candidate at the top of that ballot? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to ask a single question. In the 2 centuries and more history of the Republic, has there ever been anyone before comparable to Donald Trump? To answer that question, one has to decide first which aspect of Trump and his candidacy seems unusual. If one asks, have we ever had a presidential candidate before, other than generals who are a special case, who never held any public office? The answer is yes. As recently as 1992 in Ross Perot, who was also a billionaire businessman. Borrowing a line from the film Network, Perot buttons read, "I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore." Perot was, for a time, a much more formidable candidate than he is now remembered as being. In June 1992, only months before Election Day, he actually held a lead in the polls over President Bush, with Bill Clinton running third. But Perot's campaign imploded after he dropped out of the race, then sought to re-enter it with the improbable explanation that he had dropped out because his enemies were planning to circulate compromising photographs of his daughter on the eve of her wedding. One commentator said, "Now we know the real reason Perot bowed out. He had learned that Martians were planning to jump out of his daughter's wedding cake." Further dirty tricks included the distribution of a doctored photograph showing the head of Ross Perot attached to the body of a rational person. Perot wound up with 19% of the popular vote in 1992 and 8% in 1996, but not a single electoral vote. Perot was a third-party candidate. We can sharpen the question if we ask, has there ever been a presidential candidate of one of the major parties who had never held public office? Yes, just one. Wendell Willkie, a utility executive who became the Republican nominee in 1940, more than 3/4 of a century ago. Curiously, the only political office of any kind that Willkie had held was as a committeeman of Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine in New York City. And he hadn't held that post only a short time before. Members of the Republican Old Guard found that background very disturbing. One of them said, "I'm all in favor of the churches converting a whore, but I don't want to lead in choir the first day." In November 1940, Willkie went down to defeat. We can ask the question about Trump in yet another way. Has there ever been an American political figure who spewed nativist or racist venom? Alas, all too many. There have been indeed entire movements that were racist or nativist or both, notably the Know-Nothings of the 1850s and the racist, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s. The former originated in secret societies whose members were instructed to respond to inquiries by saying, "I know nothing." That the commentators have found it significant that Donald Trump, when asked about the neo-Nazi David Duke, replied, "I know nothing." That may be a far reach, though Trump clearly botched the opportunity to disavow Duke. It's also not evident yet whether there is any significance in the revelation that Trump's father was arrested in a Ku Klux Klan rally in Queens in the 1920s. Granted that we've had in the past movements that were nativist or racist or both, has there ever been a presidential candidate with those beliefs? Two come to mind: Strom Thurmond in 1948 and George Wallace in 1968. But unlike Trump, both of these nominees largely refrained from racist or nativist rhetoric in their presidential campaigns, settling instead for code language. And neither of them secured the nomination of a major party. Finally, let me pull these questions together by asking, have we ever before in our long history had a presidential candidate of a major party who had never held public office and who spouted nativist rhetoric? No. Donald Trump, well on his way to becoming the candidate of a major party, is unique and uniquely scary.
So that's tough to follow. I do want to mention, I can't resist but mentioning that you heard the name of John Davis. He didn't quite disappear from history. And in fact, he was a lawyer who argued for South Carolina and the lead lawyer for the states in Brown versus Board of Education. And he was one of the greatest Supreme Court oral advocates in history. Quite a life, but he lost at exactly the right time, at least from my perspective. So a few observations about where we are. First, my general observation is that in many ways we are in uncharted territory. I say that at the same time that I'm usually conscious of the fact that people tend to assume that the time in which we are in, the time in which we live, is uniquely extraordinary. And we forget a lot of our history. So when people talk about a country that's never been so politically divided, all we have to do is go back to the very beginning years of the United States, and if we understand our history puts the lie to that representation. I've sometimes said, just think about a secretary, a former secretary of the Treasury being shot in a duel of some kind by a sitting vice president. It reminds you that we've always had some deep political divisions, and after all, we fought a civil war in this country. But having said that, I think in many ways this may be an extraordinary time and may be unique. you couldn't write this story, if it was a novel, differently and make it more appealing and exciting. It would be a page turner. But there are a number of things that are in play that make this election different, both on the state and the national level. I, for most of my career, have been a civil rights lawyer, and I've done voting rights litigation. And I will tell you that some of the litigation that I was involved with, including litigation here in North Carolina, was very controversial. And people in the Democratic Party, many of them said that the work that we did at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in pushing for majority minority districts pursuant to the Voting Rights Act, that was damaging the chances of Democrats to be elected. And I could tell you what some of the responses to that were and could be. But there's no question that there was at some point a realization on the part of Republicans, even while under the Reagan administration, much of the agenda of the Civil Rights Division and the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department was subject to change by the Reagan administration. The one thing they did not do was cease to pursue majority minority districts, because they realized that in doing so, drawing those districts left surrounding districts whiter and therefore more conservative and therefore more easily winnable by Republicans. Now, let me be clear. I just won't go into all the details. I have a response to the critique of drawing those districts, but it doesn't change the reality of what the impact was. A good chunk of the Voting Rights Act has been declared unconstitutional by the Roberts Court. So that's not in play the way it was prior to that decision, the Shelby County decision. Section 5 is no longer in play. And we also see, therefore, states, including our own, taking actions that would have been subject to judicial review pursuant to Section 5. It's no longer there. So when we talk about voter ID laws, when we talk about changing either out-of-district voting or we talk about the changes with respect to early voting here in North Carolina and elsewhere, no longer in play. Not clear what the impact of that is going to be, but it's up for grabs right now. This is not the electoral process as we've known it recently. I also would point to the fact that partisan redistricting has been perfected, as we heard. It's not legal to draw districts that rely too heavily on race. Now, what we mean by too heavily, that's another conversation. But partisan redistricting has not been addressed by the Supreme Court. And as a consequence, Republicans in North Carolina and other states, Democrats would do the same thing if they could, have perfected partisan redistricting. So even if you have a state that is divided somewhat evenly when it comes to voter registration between Democrats and Republicans, maybe with Democrats having a slight edge, besides the fact that a number of Democrats vote Republican anyway, in spite of registering as Republicans, the redistricting process has given a lock in North Carolina and some other states, at least for the foreseeable future, at least to 2020, with respect to the advantage that Republicans have. A couple of other things that I want to point out quickly is that we may in fact see some third-party movement if in fact Donald Trump has a lock on the nomination for the Republican Party. Not clear on that. It's something that remains to be seen. Bloomberg has made noises about it. I frankly don't think that that dog will hunt, at least not very well, in a good chunk of the country. But he and others are talking about it. Now, let me make one observation and then go on to say a word before I cease about Donald Trump's candidacy. The one observation is that the Republican Party, as we know, has been moving further and further to the right and has become the captive of the Tea Party. I don't know who's in this room. I don't know what your politics are. But even for some of us, and I'm included, who are registered Democrats, I've been waiting for Republicans to show up, stand up and say that things have gone too far, and to reclaim their party, and to have partisan disagreements, to have elections in which they are hotly contested, but in which we don't see the continued drift to the excessive rhetoric that has, in many ways, changed the game with respect to what is the boundary line of political debate. That hasn't happened yet. And one of the big questions is, regardless of Trump's candidacy, what happens after this election on that score? Who owns the Republican Party? I'm hoping that some folks show up who have been fairly silent. Finally, and I won't go too far into this, I said we're in uncharted territory. I agree that this is a dangerous time that we're in. I posted something I got on Facebook finally last August. I've never been on Facebook. It may be a mistake to get on. I understand how it's addictive, and a lot of what's on Facebook is a race to the bottom. But I posted something in which I said, I remember reading William Shirer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich when I was in my 20s. And when you think about how that German carnival barker, supported by some thugs who was marginalized in his early years in politics, came to power, and what he did, talking about making Germany right or strong again, bringing Germany back after the Versailles Treaty, talking about the greatness that he would bring in very general terms, and demonizing Jews, Roma, or as they otherwise are known, gypsies, people who are disabled, religious minority groups, on and on. I said I think we have an American carnival barker now who has demonized women, disabled, has demonized Muslims, has demonized African Americans, Mexicans, right on down the line. It's incredible. And who is getting unbelievable support at this time. And we keep saying it can't happen here. And I hope that I'm right, or wrong about that rather. I hope that I'm not right about that. I hope that I'm being paranoid. But I have this uneasy feeling and this thought that this is how it happens. We're long past the point where we can look at this as crude political entertainment that's going on. So I'm very uneasy. I think it is a dangerous time that we are in. And I'm waiting for that moment, that Senator McCarthy moment. At long last, sir, have you no sense of decency that imploded McCarthy? I'm waiting for something like that with respect to this candidate, and it hasn't happened.
Right. I'm going to, is this on? Okay.
Yes, it's on.
All right. I don't want you to miss a word of this. It's going to be that interesting. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and part of this distinguished panel. I'm going to speak a little bit about the presidential campaigns. Of course, you're all familiar with this topic, particularly if you have cable TV. But I think it's interesting to take stock of where we are and how we got here on both political parties. I'll start with the Democratic campaign. The story here really, to me, is the unexpected rise of Senator Sanders. Interesting character. He's sort of a cross between grumpy grandpa, crazy professor, and Larry David. But he's excited many with his message about income inequality and campaign finance reform, and strikes people as very authentic. Obviously, Martin O'Malley wanted to fill this role, but more of a plastic politician, and Bernie Sanders is nothing if not authentic and real, and I think people have been drawn to that. Now, he's clearly in a tradition of progressive insurgents over time. You think about George McGovern or Gary Hart, Bill Bradley, Howard Dean, of course, President Obama to an extent. President Obama was able to broaden his appeal beyond college towns and liberals and include African American voters, and that's why he was able to win the nomination, of course, and move on to the presidency. And that's been a challenge for Senator Sanders to broaden his appeal. And really, this shouldn't surprise us. I mean, he is a self-described democratic socialist from a small state, a somewhat fringe member in the Senate. Looks likely that he'll end up being more of a message candidate. But it's interesting to think about what if Elizabeth Warren had run, how things might have been different. I mean, given how much energy is built around Bernie Sanders' campaign. Clearly, he has changed the debate, though. He's moved Hillary Clinton to the left. She's adapted to his challenge, like a capable candidate does, by co-opting his message, particularly on Wall Street, criminal justice reform, other issues. She's in the driver's seat now for the nomination, but of course has some hurdles in the rest of her campaign. The ongoing email investigation, that may fade away. The FBI could recommend prosecution. Who knows? There are clearly voter concerns about her trustworthiness. That's going to be an ongoing burden for her. And of course, it's hard to pull off being a quasi-incumbent. Which she is in some ways, because it's hard to articulate a case for change when you've been part of the previous two presidential terms. And as Dr. Leuchtenberg knows, in modern times, a political party has only been able to extend to a third term once, when George H.W. Bush succeeded President Reagan. So that could be a challenge for her. Now, she has one big thing going for her as the probable nominee, and that's the complete chaos on the Republican side. It's been fascinating. It's been polarizing, as my colleagues have already addressed. You know, a year ago, I would have predicted a likely contest between, say, Jeb Bush and a conservative alternative, likely Scott Walker or maybe Ted Cruz. So you should bear that in mind if I make any further predictions this evening. But looking back, of course, it seems rather obvious that Governor Bush is a fine, decent man, but he had some self-inflicted wounds. He hadn't run for office in quite a while. He didn't fit an anti-establishment mood. People were tired of dynasties. They were angry about President Obama, and Republicans wanted their candidate to articulate that. And he wanted to run a general election campaign before he had settled the ugly business of winning the primary. So here comes Donald Trump in June, riding down the escalator at Trump Towers. At the time I thought this is just it's funny. I'll put it that way. I thought it was funny. I think very few people would have thought that he would endure, much less catch fire to the extent he has, because everything about him seems so over the top. But he's drowned out more serious and more conventional candidates, played against all the rules. I mean, he's fought with all three of the past Republican presidential nominees, the Pope, and even Fox News. And I don't say that lightly because Fox News is the information delivery source for most Republican primary voters. And so he's just gone against the rules in almost every instance. And it's led to some very entertaining but really raucous debates. I mean, I don't recall any debates being quite as crazy as these has been. But he has managed to project a certain brand of strength and success and disdain for political correctness to those voters, and he has a keen ability to keep the media spotlight with very provocative and outrageous statements, which, of course, have been very divisive. He's benefited significantly from the fragmented field. I mean, we started out with 16 serious Republican candidates, all of whom wanted to ultimately emerge as the alternative to him and thus refrained from criticizing him. They figured he would eventually implode, and perhaps he will, but they didn't want to turn off his voters. And so, to me, the surprise has been his durability as a candidate as well as the passivity of his opponents until recent weeks. Now, the next 2 weeks, in my opinion, will be determinative in the Republican race. The winner-take-all primaries in Florida and Ohio present Trump with a great opportunity to basically close out the rival campaigns of Marco Rubio and John Kasich. It also presents them with the opportunity to stop his momentum if those two are able to win those states. Obviously, Senator Cruz has the fuel to keep going. And it's important to remember that of the delegates allocated so far, Trump has won 46%. But you need over half to be nominated. And if this goes all the way to the convention, without Trump having a majority of the delegates, I'll predict he will not be the nominee because I think the Republican Party will pull out all stops to stop him, essentially because while the rules vary state by state, these delegates may be bound on a first ballot to vote for proportionally as their state has voted. But after that, it could get really interesting. And I think potentially you could see even a candidate emerge who hasn't even declared yet. I mean, that's one potential scenario. The other potential scenario is he wins in Florida and Ohio and is basically the inevitable nominee. Now, his brand of showmanship and populism and nationalism is at odds with conservative philosophy, and that's why I say I think in a convention we'd end up with a different result. He clearly has intense support among a plurality of Republican voters, but not a majority, and I think that's going to lead to essentially a Republican civil war over the next few weeks and potentially months to come.
I'm sitting here looking at my name tag. It says Hodding Carter III. My father was a believer that the thing that would save the South was the creation of a Republican Party along the lines of what Eisenhower seemed to promise, a businessman's party, the new suburban Southern Republican to kill the one-party system in the South. And he believed that with some depth, which preceded General Eisenhower, and did not really follow him, actually. A lot of things happened, not least being that the notion of an urban, moderate Republican Party was more a pipe dream than a possibility. But even more so at the time that Eisenhower made his run, there was not yet the mass disaffection in the South by white Southerners from the Democratic Party. I've been a knee-jerk Democrat all my life, and so, as he would say, I was just a knee-jerk. And put that. My son, however, is a Hodding Carter you've got to really understand, because he represents precisely one of the great facts of the current political atmosphere. He is one of 11 of my children and grandchildren who's for Bernie Sanders. And all of the children in this family were people who worked in the Democratic Party mechanisms in one way or another for much of their life. They don't even want to discuss it with me. They find me to be, at this point, somewhat rigid in my failure to understand the failure of the political establishment. Just put that aside a minute. But if you're asking what people are going to do in the national election, ask yourself particularly about the young disillusioned, since it's hard as hell to get young people out anyway, and then to be crushed as they will be. Well, I'm not going to say will anymore. None of you who thought at the beginning of this process that our man, Mr. Trump, was going to be this far along, hold up your hand and then show me where you wrote it, and show me. Because the fact is, there are many things that journalists are. Sometimes we occasionally get the facts on the ground at the moment right. We are lousy predictors. We are hardly ever very good at predicting. And most of the political commentators are good from week to week, but God save that you should bet on their predictions. Because one of the major predictions for those of us who worked very hard for this super primary was to create an institutional frame that would allow both a loud voice for the South, but also a loud voice for a more moderate South, and would in any case free us from always having to contend as Democrats in the South from candidates from the very liberal Northeast. When we put together in 1988, the person who was believed to be the beneficiary was a little man named Al Gore. And Al ran in that case about the way that it came later, which was like a dry stream. And the people who were the beneficiaries of that particular time were named Dukakis and Jesse Jackson. It was not what was dreamed of by those who created it. I say that for another reason, that we are now busy talking about a circumstance in the Republican Party, and so we understood for one moment what we were talking about. There is no conservative Republican Party. There is nothing left of the conservative Republican Party. To pretend that there is an establishment of old conservative Republicans left is to simply violate the English language. Reactionaries are the starting point, and then know-nothings come behind them. The guys who you keep looking to save us from the horrors which may be coming are people who have long since been rolled over or capitulated or signed up with the Tea Party, and they're on. My old friend, and he really was, my old friend Mitch McConnell, one of the big men in the Ripon Society, the moderate Republican Party base for youngsters. Mitch is the closest thing to a man with principle on the conservative side in the Republican leadership, and his principle is do whatever you can do to get elected. Mitch has no principles at all. And from that leadership position over is what you're looking at. But the truth is that you did not have a whole bunch of nice little conservatives running in this last race. You had a handful of people that some of you all like a lot. Me living in Florida when Jeb Bush was governor did not make me think he was a moderate. It made me think he was a guy who thought if he could destroy state government's role in the economy, it would be a good thing. I refer Jeb Bush's inaugural speech when he was governor for the first time, in which he dreamed of the day that the great buildings representing state government would be gone from the front of the Capitol, and we could return everything to the people at the local level. Now, that's lots of things, folks, but conservative usually means that you want to hold what you have, improve it, but destroying is not usually what the meant. Be that as it may. He's your conservative. He's your moderate. He's your representative of the establishment. Tell me what it is that crypto-fascist Ted Cruz is. Do I look to him, my fellow Princetonian, with some hope for the future if he's the nominee? Hell no. Or that little absolutely malleable ambitious, pretty boy from Florida who does not have a principle that holds him intact from one week to the next, and who has as his sponsor one of the nastiest men in Florida with more money and less sense than anybody I know, except that's a large category, so that's a lie. But there is no there when you're looking at a two-party system in which people believe the point of governance is to govern and the point of a party is to rationally assemble a position. The Republican Party has spent much of the entire Obama administration, but not just the Obama administration, doing one thing, saying no. And no is a wonderful word that has nothing to do with governance. And the people who are at the very center of that are the people who occasionally I see my fellow journalists talking about being the salvation of the Republic. The man who was considered, along with a few others, the fellow who is the senior senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, said something the other day which was almost as unacceptable to people of my generation as the front page of the Daily Tar Heel the other day. Anybody see the front page of the Daily Tar Heel the other day? Put it aside. When somebody remembers what it is, I want you to stand up and say. But as Lindsey Graham said of his own party, we've gone batshit. That's Lindsey Graham talking about his party in public, not on ha-ha radio. It has. It simply has. And it is a statement by an absolute unabashed partisan. And I got to tell you, I got 5 roommates from Princeton, all of whom are Republicans. And the one thing I'm going to spend, well, 2 of them unfortunately not with us, but the one thing I'm going to spend from now until Election Day saying is, you owe it to the Republic to understand your Republican Party is nowhere on the scene, and that you must, for this Republic, do what you used to tell me I had to do, that them talking to me for the Republic, which is to abandon the radicals that have seized it. There is one major party in America, and it's what our kids do know. It's what we know, and which we seem to be incapable of dealing with, and it's the party of money. Money is the great party in America, and is particularly the great party of the Republican Party. And we are at a point which, again, since we have no way to turn as far as the courts are concerned, it is required that people at every level stand up and say no. And so when my kids tell me Bernie Sanders has said no, and he gets his money from lots of folks and not just from the big boys, you understand it is not impossible to do what has to be done. But those of you who have been in North Carolina as long as you have know perfectly well that one of the major reasons that we fell out of the bed and into incompetence was we were so damn smug, so happy about our eternal control, so certain that it was God-given that we were going to be here forever. And when the time came that a black man was nominated, running for the rafters all over the state were some of the major figures of the Democratic Party, terrified that it was going to destroy the party, which by that time was already a husk compared to its past. And it was a husk because it was not run by any set of something more creative than the perpetuation of the old regime. I am one of those who, until 2 weeks ago, thought that Trump was a joke. But what I've never thought was a joke was the disintegration of the old conservative Republican Party. Ted sort of put his finger on it in this sort of most significant way. It doesn't matter what he says he's for. It is echoed in some of the worst rhetoric of some of the worst people in politics of our time. Local, state, national, international. And it's not acceptable. The one thing you can hope is that he no more believes that than half the other things he's seen over the years. But you know what? The people who are voting for him believe it. They do believe it. And you have to understand that a nation that has that many people who believe it is a nation which can, in fact, somehow, God save us all, elect him. And then we'll see. I look forward to seeing all of you out there carrying placards, fighting like dogs, speaking up, not sitting passively listening to your radio and watching your television and making fun of the activists. Got to save the republic, friends. Got to save the republic.
A great panel, a lot to think about, and we're going to take a little stretch break. And if you have any questions, I hope you have written them on the cards that were handed out. Anybody have anything? Want some more water? Okay, gentlemen, we're about to start. We have several good questions and some that were emailed in a little earlier. I guess, Bill, one of them is, many agree that the current state of U.S. politics is the most polarized it has been in a generation. Historically, what has driven politics to depolarize, and is there a future where bipartisanship is more valuable than party ideology? If so, how do we get there?
I
Pass
think
him the
other
microphone.
members of the panel would like to talk to that question. Has it ever been this polarized? As Ted Shaw was saying, we have had very bitter divisions from the very beginning of the Republic. The way in which those divisions ended was the disappearance of one of the political parties, the disappearance of the Federalist Party after the Hartford Convention and the recreation of a new party system. Political scientists over the years have identified at least 5 political systems, with questions of whether there's been more since the 5th party system. And one could imagine that what is true today is not going to be true tomorrow or a decade from now. And we probably can't imagine what the political landscape will be then. I remember that in 1964, I was doing the presidential election analysis for NBC for Huntley and Brinkley, and the Goldwater defeat was so extraordinary. He lost all of the East, all of the Midwest, all of the Far West, and there was talk the following week in the New York Times about the Republican Party disappearing as the Whig Party had in the 1850s. But 4 years later, Richard Nixon was in the White House. So I think there are real limits to how far ahead we can see. And I, at least for one on the panel, would be very hesitant to imagine what the landscape is going to be even 4 years from now.
Let me just add, I think that's right. There are 2 things, though, that I think have changed our landscape. One is, of course, as we all know, the 24-hour news cycle and, the red piece of that and the blue piece of that. It's eternal, it seems. And the second thing, of course, is money, as Harding Carter talked about. the role of money and of Citizens United, the court has contributed to a fundamental shift in the paradigm. And it's another reason why we can't predict, at least I can't predict, what's going to happen, in the next cycle or even in this one.
I tend to see history as a family, and I'm never sure about the most polarized it's ever been, frankly. When Jack Kennedy was assassinated, fraternity boys all over the South were having parties. If you don't believe it, I'll show you the clippings. When Franklin Roosevelt died, my uncle, the good Yaley of the class of 1936, was at the Union Club celebrating. This is something he was proud of. We have had immense polarization at times, sometimes of crisis, and of course we have immense polarization now. And everybody's so tender about this, I won't be. A vast amount of what's called conservative reaction is racist reaction, plain, simple, and unadorned. It is a reality. The conservatives were always right when they said you can't change a man's heart with law. Of course, the answer was you change their behavior. But now that we're letting up on the law, a lot of the old stuff comes seeping out. It's not even seeping anymore, for God's sake. It is there, and it's very visible. And nothing is more, when I was spokesman, when I was really vehemently mad about a question, it was when they got me. And when you call somebody a racist, and he says, "What do you mean I'm a racist?" I say, well, if you quack like a racist and you walk like a racist, you are a racist. And many of us still are. And when I say us, let us be clear. Again, in my extended family, there are people right at this moment who believe the Republic was destroyed on the day that the old dispensation was knocked out.
And I'm going to say I was at an event not too long ago, and as everybody looked at their phones and saw that Justice Scalia died, you would have thought somebody was at a basketball game. I mean, they were cheering, they were dancing, they were very happy. It's like, oh, we've been praying for this, like hoping this would happen now. And we do live in those times. And I have a freshman son coming home for spring break this weekend, and he's like, oh, when I come home, then I can vote. I was like, shoot, I haven't told him who to vote for yet. I mean, we haven't had that conversation. I'm like, what do you mean, who are you going to vote for? I'm like, why did I let him come home? No, but we have a lot of work to do. Another question, it's during the South Carolina town hall a few weeks ago, many of the Republican and Democratic candidates had a wide range of similar answers toward the involvement of Apple in breaking its own encryption to help the FBI. Only Marco Rubio presented an answer that showed nuance with how to treat this topic. Why haven't the parties taken a stance on this somewhat new field of personal liberty in a digital age?
Scares the crap out of them.
And when they do, what do you expect them to be? Anybody want to take that on?
Number one, our incumbent U.S. Senator definitely has taken a stand on this. Richard Burr is chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he has basically said that Apple should allow its phones to be cracked. And on this, I fundamentally disagree. But nonetheless, that's probably going to be that may well be an interesting debate in the course of this election season, simply because you do have you have now I think in the generation of millennials who are soon going to be more numerous in North Carolina than baby boomers. By the way, they'll be the most numerous cohort in North Carolina within a matter of a few years. You have a generation that is digital and that always has been digital and has known nothing but digital life. And they are going to take a much different view about issues of privacy and security and national security than their parents or their grandparents are going to take. And so there may be a bit of a generational cleavage that takes place, and it's going to be a very interesting to see how this plays out over time.
It's a harder issue than I've ever made it to be, but it's not going to get easier until, in fact, those who are most involved with it start talking before the crisis instead of after the crisis. This is a whole set of questions like this that must be resolved under a democratic system, which is not exactly the way they've been resolved up until now. It's either through secrecy or stonewalling or sort of little passive semi-reforms. We got to have security. We also have to have personal security in our various forms of self. And that is not something that winning a debating society kind of deal is going to get us to. I mean, this has got to be talked through and talked through and talked through.
Well, Sarah, I have a question for you. It says, what are the strategic implications of Mitch McConnell's current aversion to holding hearings on a Supreme Court nominee while at the same time trying to bring together the GOP establishment against a Trump nomination? Does he want to have his cake and eat it too?
Yes. I like the yes-no ones. No, I think this is a great question. And when the vacancy opened up on the court, the first thing that I thought to myself after Mitch McConnell came out and said, no hearings, no meetings, no nothing, was that was a strategic move. And that it was a move to try to push President Obama more toward a moderate candidate. And maybe that's me giving Mitch McConnell more credit. Maybe Hadi can speak to that. But personally, I thought he was doing this intentionally to try to get a more moderate candidate proposed by President Obama, thinking that there's a lot to gamble on here, right? We're not sure who the next president's going to be. If anything, right now, it might be more favorable, given the fundamentals I mentioned earlier, toward the Democratic Party, especially now given some of the disarray within the Republican Party itself. So McConnell is taking a gamble to start with. And then there's the addition of we don't know who's going to control the Senate. And I think while we're expecting still a Republican-controlled Senate, there is a realistic possibility that come 2017, we end up with a Democrat in the White House and a democratically controlled Senate. And so my thinking was McConnell must be aware of this, and he must be thinking, well, let's try to push this nominee as far to the middle of the road as we can go. He's continued to dig in his heels. Of course, there's no nominee yet, so it's a little hard to update completely. But I do think that we will see some movement on this issue. And I'm not sure who the nominee, of course, is going to be. I think President Obama himself is being strategic here as well. I think he's going to look for someone that's going to force either McConnell's hand or Chuck Grassley's hand, was a new name that was floated out there today, a popular Eighth Circuit Appeals Court nominee who is from Iowa, who Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, has said wonderful things about in the past. So why not hold hearings? Other names that are floated out there have gone through Senate confirmation with rigging endorsements from both sides of the aisle. Why not hold hearings? And Obama is well aware of that. And Obama is also well aware of the presidential struggle within the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. And if a nominee will not go through, and if people are dissatisfied with government doing nothing, I think he sees this as Hillary Clinton or even Bernie Sanders being able to pick up there and say, we need a Democrat in the White House. We need to confirm Loretta Lynch. We need to bring in the women. We need to bring in the minority groups. And if that's what you want, America, then we're your party. And that's Obama's perspective. Yeah, sure.
Very quickly, I'm sorry. I think a name that was floated recently who strategically would be a brilliant move in many ways is Brian Sandoval, who's the governor of Nevada. Who
was strategic.
Who dropped that?
Because that would really tie the Republicans'
Republican
hands.
governor.
Yeah, Republican governor from Nevada who was a U.S. attorney, who was attorney general. I lived and worked out there for 4 years, and so I know him a little bit. But certainly I see the hands of Harry Reid all over this also in saying this is a nominee who would easily pass the qualifications test. There's no doubt that he knows the law and understands the law and has litigated and has also prosecuted. But it would be something that would really make it very difficult for Republicans to refuse to hold a hearing on someone who was rumored to be a potential vice presidential choice for Mitt Romney 4 years ago. And so it's going to get more interesting before it gets less interesting.
Well, the rumor about Sandoval raises another issue. Sandoval has said in the last few days that he does not want to be nominated at the present time. There's a notion that somewhere down the line he would like to be a Supreme Court justice. But the rumor about Sandoval has caused considerable uneasiness on the part of liberal Democrats. So it's not simply that Obama has to find someone who's going to be acceptable to the Republican Senate. He also has to find someone who the Democrats in the Senate are going to unite behind. And that's a tough assignment for him.
So I've testified at 2 recent Supreme Court nominations. I've been involved with nominations for the district courts of appeals over many years, and involved in these and watched these partisan fights. With all due respect, sir, I think that there's too much. That you're giving too much credit with respect to what the Republicans are thinking about strategically. I don't think there's much strategic about this. I think it is just flat out opposition to anything that this president does, and a commitment not to let him get an appointment to the Supreme Court, particularly at this stage when the court holds the potential to flip. People I know, I talked to somebody in Washington who's very much involved in these issues, and I said, so what do you think this Sandoval thing was? And was it strategic? Did the president really mean it? And he said that he couldn't dismiss it as just strategic. He thought maybe the president actually meant it, but I can tell you, you're absolutely right about liberals and progressives, and it would be a huge betrayal in their eyes. And the question they ask is, if the table was flipped, would you see Republicans nominating a Democrat at this stage? And nobody thinks, in their right mind, nobody thinks that that would happen. One other thought on this. Keeping this deadlock, or potential deadlock in the Supreme Court, think about what happened in 2000. We talked about how closely split this country is. I'm not saying that the Supreme Court was the best way to resolve that disputed election, but should that happen again, what would happen with a 4-4 court? The court couldn't resolve it, assuming that nobody leaves their fold. On the other hand, I don't see the country accepting a court of appeals, making that decision. So this is a profound disability to have that seat left open.
Well, we've been talking a little bit about millennials and how they'll outnumber boomers, at least in this state soon. So, Farrell, and I wanted to ask you, because the students seem to love you. These millennials, we know they are a big voting group, but I heard someone say they treat elections as they treat Hollywood movies. They only come out for the blockbusters. So I guess the question is, can we depend on them as a voting block of change, a sustainable voting block these days?
Well, I've got one of my classes working on that question right this moment. Maybe that's where the question came from one of my students. It is clear that the voter turnout trends went downward after the enactment of the amendment to give 18-year-old, to move the voting age down to 18, and so that 18 to 29-year-olds vote at a lesser rate generally than their elders. But there's some indication of an uptick, again, depending on the excitement of the election. It takes a while to form the habit of voting and get rooted in a community. And rooted in your lives. And so I'm not terribly concerned, but I do admire groups like Common Cause and others that work at stimulating turnout. In a more general comment about that, this state has gone through a 30-year period. We've documented. Tad Biles started it, and I kept it going, and of tracking voter turnout in both presidential years and off years. And this state went from one of the lowest to one of the highest over the course of 30 years of getting voters registered to vote. And we're in for an experiment here with the voter ID law and some of the other changes. We got up to nearly 90% of eligible voters actually registered. That doesn't mean they all voted. And that was over a series of years. It was the motor voter law. It was the early registration, the early voting period. A lot of what seemed at the time to be modest technical changes all added up to a rather extraordinary increase. And I'll be happy to show you the chart that we've been keeping since the 1960s, actually since 1960. And we don't know where it's going now. I'm hopeful it'll hang up there, you know, in the same percentages. But so I don't see the issue of voter turnout just being a burden on millennials. It's all of us.
No, but we depend on the youth to restore our own faith and idealism, frankly. I mean, we're always putting too much of a burden on the young. It's always absurd. They're not going to actually lead us into the promised land. But pretending that we think they will is a way to make us get around to the business of trying to do it ourselves. I was making a list of all of the generations that have been identified since 1957 when I graduated to the silent generation. May I say that at least half of them were bullshit. I mean, they did not have a lasting effect as described at the time. And I will tell you, the millennials are the most, self-indulged and they're not going to be the answer to the world. They're wonderful kids, some of them, and some of them think that the greatest life experience is to see themselves on Facebook. I mean, it's just, I'm sorry.
They come out for the blockbusters. Well, one thing, Peter, much has been made of the high Republican turnout in the primaries compared to low Democratic turnout. How significant is this enthusiasm gap? You know, one thing I heard was, of course, the Democratic turnout isn't as high. It's not as many people to thumb through on the primary list. But what do you think?
I agree with that. I think you've had more excitement, entertainment, polarization on the Republican side. Secretary Clinton, Senator Sanders they've crossed swords on occasion, but generally have been respectful of one another. That doesn't make for as much of an exciting campaign as 16 Republicans tearing each other to shreds. So I'm hesitant to draw too many conclusions about an excitement gap beyond the fact that the Republican race has just been more energizing.
Yeah, Peter, I think this election and others we could cite, you and I both talked about them, more dirty campaigns will get up higher turnout. I mean, these people say we need civil campaigns to people come out. No, when voters really feel that there's a stake, that the election really means something. And some of that has to do with candidates. This politics in America is a contact sport. It's competitive.
Sometimes with rules, sometimes without them.
That's right. And so voters will come out when they really feel energized that their vote really means something. And that's not always the quiet and calm civil campaigns.
Well, I have a couple of Hillary Clinton questions. I don't know if it's Sarah, Ted, anybody. I'm going to read both of them. One of them, given the current investigation of Hillary Clinton's handling of classified material, is there any scenario she could be deemed ineligible to run or ineligible to serve if elected? If so, when she becomes ineligible to run after the convention meets, what would happen? And someone also asked, we've heard much tonight about Trump. Let's ask about Clinton. With such a strong negative opinion on her integrity and honesty among the nation's center, how will this impact her campaign?
Well, I think it would be foolish to say that there's no chance that she would not be subjected to some prosecution. But I think it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. If she were, and if she were disabled, I think the question asks if that happens after the convention. I think that she still would be a candidate, and people would have to vote or not vote for her. I think that's pretty much all up in the air, but I'd be very surprised. I think for quite some time, conservatives have done a very effective job in smearing her, and she hadn't helped herself at times. But they've done a very, very effective job in smearing her, and some of that is sticking in people's minds and is going to stick. I think the question is, if the Republican nominee turns out to be Donald Trump and he's running against Hillary Clinton, what people are going to think is more of a threat. I have to think back to, I think it was Governor Edwards in Louisiana. Am I right?
And David Duke.
Each time.
And David Duke.
And you remember the bumper sticker. Remember he ran against David Duke. Okay. And the bumper sticker was, vote for the crook. It's really important.
I miss him.
I think Sarah and I were discussing this earlier about what might happen, and I don't think, well, you never know what ham sandwich is going to go in front of a grand jury to be potentially indicted, but I think while it is unlikely that Secretary Clinton is going to be subjected to a criminal indictment, if something like that were to happen, I think that before the convention, I would think Vice President Biden could step in and be a very credible candidate and probably mop the field with everybody, as far as I can tell, as far as someone who has he checks a lot of the boxes that the voters who are disaffected this year seem to be looking for. Someone who has a very strong aura of authenticity. He also has a level of experience that's pretty unparalleled. And I am not a liberal Democrat, but I will say that in the current atmosphere, that Vice President Biden would be someone who would be a very difficult candidate to defeat, given the current divisiveness and the like. And of course, I'm certain that the president would be more than happy to turn over the keys to all of his voter operations to the vice president to allow that to mobilize voters' support.
Bill, do you remember what the procedure is in the vacation of the nomination before the election and after the convention? We replaced we replaced poor old Tom Eagleton by the National Committee vote, yes, and put in another vice presidential nominee when he withdrew. Would that be the same procedure?
Yes, that's right, Harding. The hard thing to remember is that political parties are private associations in the United States. And that was carried to such a degree that the Supreme Court, with justices such as Brandeis and Cardozo and Stone on the bench, unanimously upheld the white primary as late as 1936 on the grounds that this was a private Democrat Party was a private group that could make its own rules, and it wasn't until Smith v. Allwright in 1944 that the court thankfully overthrew that ruling. So it's not going to be a matter of law. It's going to be a matter that will be decided by the party itself. On this larger question of whether something like this might hurt Hillary Clinton if it came up after the election, given, as Ted was saying, the vendetta against Hillary Clinton on Benghazi that's been going on for so long now, and with so little base, I would anticipate that we might have a circumstance much like 1940 when FDR ran for a third term. That was regarded as a taboo that no one dared break, and it was something that did agitate some voters, but the voters who were agitated by the breaking of the third term taboo were the ones who were going to vote against Roosevelt anyway. And the ones who were going to be bothered about Benghazi or an indictment of that sort are likely most to be those who weren't going to vote for Hillary Clinton in the first place.
Here's one. I don't know if it's, I'll just read it. When a sports commentator makes a racist or minority gender derogatory remark, they are immediately reprimanded, apologize publicly and profusely, and frequently are demoted or lose their jobs, and the American people applaud the disciplinary action. Why are the American people not holding Donald Trump to the same standards as sports commentators? After all, at the end of the day, sports are a game, entertainment, while our politicians create our laws and policies.
Okay, I'll stick my neck out here. The reason is that Donald Trump doesn't care, and the media loves it. If you look at, I saw recently I saw a story recently which said that if you look at free media for all of the Republican presidential candidates, that is, the number of minutes they have gotten over the air or through cable news, that Donald Trump has gotten more free media, twice as much as all of the other candidates combined. So the 24/7 news cycle that Ted talked about earlier. He says outrageous things. He thinks this is a reality show. He thinks that this is his coronation as the king of reality TV. This is the Truman Show, if you will. This is something that is surreal to a lot of us. But why? Well, he is denounced. He is denounced by Senator Ben Sasse, a freshman from Nebraska who is a Tea Party candidate, basically said, I will not vote for Donald Trump, and if Donald Trump's a nominee, I'm going to find somebody else to vote for. And he's trying to lead a movement to stop Trump. So you've got people inside of politics and inside the Republican Party, and certainly inside the conservative movement, who would love nothing more than for Donald Trump to crawl into a hole and go away. But he has tapped into a group of what I call, to some extent, Reagan Democrats, if you will.
Well, the other thing is that, I get the point of the question, but of course, sports writers or broadcasters, they work for somebody. Donald Trump doesn't. So who's going to fire him? He's trying to work for the American people, to win that election. And so that's, of course, one significant difference. But the other thing is that, as Harding pointed out, he's tapping into a very deep vein of racism that has characterized American politics for a long time. And maybe a long time is an understatement. So, you've seen the polls of people in, I think, South Carolina, who, the percentages of, those who wish that the Civil War had been won by, the slaveholding states, and you've seen, the other polls with respect to what people believe about race. He's tapping into that, and he's doing it more openly and honestly. Honestly is not the word I really want to use with respect to him, but it is less dog whistle and more open than politics usually have been. And so the only way to ironically tell him you're fired is not to hire him.
You actually made a point that I, as an old journalist, hate to repeat. At the time, several of you have heard me say this. I'm sorry. You've heard me say everything, so it doesn't matter. At the time of Joe McCarthy, there was a pledge taken in the newspaper business. We're not going to let this happen again. When a son of a gun comes out here and puts this kind of lies out, we're going to be right behind him. We're going to follow up every time. Well, that was a very short-lived pledge, but it was a sincere one at the moment. My real problem is when I go to various trade organizations, that is to say journalism organizations, and wonder to myself, who's the there to take such a pledge today? The atomization on the one hand of the delivery system, and quite frankly, the absolutely disconnection between much of what is called journalism and journalism values is total. And beyond all that, he is throwing so many lies out, he makes Joe McCarthy look like one of the great serious men of public life, and it's very hard to keep up with him. But I go back to your point. One of the great enablers out there is the media for this guy, and it's a repetitive enabler.
I'd like to take a different view on this. My response to the question would be, it's not true that the American people have not denounced Trump. And it's not true that the media have not denounced Trump. In this very week, the Washington Post has said Trump has to be stopped. The Boston Globe has said this. There's been denunciation after denunciation about his remarks about women, about Senator McCain. A whole series of attacks have been leveled on him. He's had the support of a third of the voters in Republican primaries. He has yet to show that he supports that he has the support of the American people. The very fact that Donald Trump can get such mileage out of attacking the media is an indication that the media has been attacking him. And one last thought. Certainly, there's far too much racism in this country. But let's remember that the man in the White House is Barack Obama. And he got elected, and he got reelected. So this is not a hopelessly racist nation.
Nobody I respect more than you, and nobody do I think is better informed about each and every era that we're in. But if you believe that saying what the Boston Globe and the Washington Post and similar things has to do with what it is that people understand is the delivery system of the media, I think you're just living in a different era. They are not relevant to anything except us, and I mean the us that live within the bubble of either the academy or of much of organized governmental life. I wish to God that they were still there. As I watch each one of them lose their circulation on a basis now which makes most of us who cared about print begin to despair, beyond despair, to begin to wonder if it's possible to save any of them. And one of the major reasons you can't save them is that people do not find them relevant enough to abandon their attraction to the jitterbug of much of contemporary media and to go into the serious place where they spend serious time calling into account people who are saying seriously defective things. Nobody is prouder than I am of those folks. I hope to God 10 years from now that at least half of those major publications are still in existence. As you know as well as anybody, they're terrified at the New York Times right now.
I'm drawn to agree with both Hotting and Bill Leuchtenberg, even as they disagree. But let me try to parse it out. None of us, folks like me who have lived in the South almost all of our lives, can ignore what has been called the deep vein of racism in the region, and it is and the manifestation of that through the Trump campaign and this campaign, in this year, as it was in other years, is hard to ignore. And it's not just a political problem; it's a problem and an issue that confronts us in our education system. It's an issue that confronts us in our religious denominations. How do we cope with this persistence of discrimination, of demeaning people because of whatever kind of orientation their lives or just their birth imprints on them. And so, but at the same time, what's difficult for me, both as a faculty member here and as a journalist, is to how to quantify the deep vein of racism. How far does it go? And as Bill said, Trump has not won a majority yet within the Republican Party, and the Republican Party doesn't represent all of America. Neither does the Democratic Party represent all of America. Their coalitions do not overlap hardly at all. Different groups of voters, so that you take South Carolina. There was 1% of the voters of South Carolina who voted in the Republican primary were black folks. It's a totally, almost exclusive. The Republican Party is almost an exclusively white party, whereas Hillary Clinton won a smashing victory in South Carolina. So who do South Carolinians prefer? Well, that's going to be tested in the general election. And so this is a story that's still to be played out. And the question is whether Democrats and the media and churches and educators confront the issues of race and civil society, the cohesion of civil society that the Trump campaign has raised in this election cycle.
If I could add a little perspective on the fact that roughly, Farrell, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe 30% of American voters would be eligible or might be inclined to participate in a Republican primary. Maybe 30%. Yeah. So if you extrapolate that roughly a third of Republican voters thus far have backed Trump's campaign, we're talking about 10% of American voters. And I want to be hesitant about drawing sweeping conclusions based on the intensity of that support among what is a relatively limited number of people, or necessarily projecting that we understand completely why they have chosen to back him. The reasons people do things like that, sometimes very conscious and obvious, has been suggested, and sometimes it's a lot more complex. And I think I'd also suggest that we not conflate conservative philosophy with racism, because I think that is way too broad of a brush, to be fair to any group of people, to suggest something that sweeping. And I'm characterizing it that way. I'm not suggesting my colleagues have done so, but I think
who is that we?
No, I think when you look at, say, South Carolina, and you saw Marco Rubio of Cuban American heritage being endorsed by the Republican governor of South Carolina, who is of Indian American heritage, and a junior United States senator, a Republican, Tim Scott, who is African American, that was a different face of the Republican Party. It is likely to be the future face of the Republican Party, more so than Donald Trump, because, as Dr. Leuchtenberg says, what may seem to be ascendant today is not necessarily the case tomorrow, and I want us to bear that in mind. And I particularly refer you to the remarks of House Speaker Paul Ryan earlier this week, who really is the intellectual leader of the conservative movement today. I mean, the ideas guy who completely renounced bigotry as being in any way representative of the Republican Party. I'm not suggesting that there aren't significant elements of what's going on in Trump's campaign that are related to everything we've discussed tonight. Yes, of course. But I just want us to be careful about sweeping generalizations.
Can I just add one thing? So the comments there just made by Peter made me think about the role of primaries in our system. And it's something that my research focuses on a lot, usually at the congressional level. But I think it's worth paying attention to here. And if we really are thinking about or considering that there is a potential Republican Party that has a diverse face moving forward, the party has to be very careful with this primary system and this season if it so chooses to elect someone like Donald Trump. It's a risk for the party. It's a huge concern for the party to have someone as its figurehead who's not inclusive of people who do not look like him. I think that's a huge concern, and then I think that's going to lead the Republican Party, if we're thinking about it disbanding, we're thinking about what happens in the future, to strongly consider the role that primaries are playing in the electoral process. And obviously at the congressional level, they've already had a massive effect. This is why we see so much polarization in Congress, or one of the reasons why we see so much polarization. But if it's also going to produce such polarizing figures at the national level, at the federal level, within our presidential system, I'm not saying definitely go back and have smoke-filled rooms, but it is worth considering how different the nominees might look today if we did have smoke-filled rooms. And who the parties would be picking to be their figurehead would definitely be someone very different than Donald Trump on the Republican side, and would lead that Republican Party to a much more bright future with regards to diversity that we're seeing today.
I want to just look, I'm very conscious, wonderfully conscious of all the change that's taken place in the society. And I, for one, don't believe and choose not to believe that the majority of white Americans are steeped in racism, although I think, frankly, we've all been tainted by it, all of us, one way or another. But that's another kind of discussion. But I think about, Mitch McConnell, and Harding, you say you know him
Very well.
Very well. I can tell you that as an African American, and it's not by myself. I'm not by myself on this. It seems to me that it appeared that he was dripping with venom from the very beginning of the election of this president, saying that his number one priority, or the number one priority of the party, is to make sure that he wasn't successful in a way that I don't remember any other minority leader saying with respect to the election of a president, or now majority leader. Most important thing, not the economy, not being safe from terrorism, not anything else, but to make sure he was an unsuccessful president. it may be that I'm misreading him. It may be other things going on. I've read the other articles about how he's all about winning the elections. It's just about that. But the Republican Party has, unfortunately, been caught up with this issue of race for a long time. So while I don't believe that most white people are voting racism, I think the party has been trapped or has actually not been trapped, has embraced the politics of race for a long time. What's that book that was written about Nixon and the politics of race and presidential elections? I can't think of the name of it. So it doesn't have to. You're right that it's been 30%. I mean, I loved hearing what you had to say. Maybe it's the brightest, most hopeful thing that we've heard tonight. And it may be that there's no way there's a clear path to the presidency for Donald Trump. But it also is possible that he gets the nomination, and there are a lot of people who may not agree with everything he said, who vote for him for, this reason over here, this reason over there. I'm just not sanguine. I can't be. I don't think any of us can be. As I said, we're in uncharted territory right now. And so, I'm waiting for somebody to come along or something to happen to relieve me of this sense of dread.
Well, Ted, one thing I'll say is that if there were Republicans, active Republicans, who had a reason to vote for Donald Trump, they'd say, well, we can trust him to make Supreme Court nominations that we would like, or we could trust him to support tax policy that we like, or we could support him because of some other basic Republican fiscal issue. They're not going to find it, or he may have said it one time, but he said 10 other things another time.
There's no substance there.
So that's probably the most reassuring thing about the possibility that Republicans might decide to embrace, Trump despite all of his flaws, because he's really good on this issue. He's basically not really good on pretty much any issue except the issue that will, I think, may be, as much as anything else, the issue that cleaves Republicans more than anything else, and that's the issue of immigration. And there is a huge divide among those of us who think that we should have a rational immigration policy that is welcoming, but that does allow for some limitations based on a variety of factors, and those who want to force the Mexicans to build a wall. And that's an issue of cleavage that Republicans that have not worked out and may not work out. And it may be the demise of the party.
I think most of the last questions we have are about Trump. And one of them is, there's one popular rallying cry here from GOP presidential candidates and from other elected officials that they don't like Donald Trump and they don't want him to be the Republican nominee, but how come no one can stop him?
Very quickly, math can stop him. He would have to win about 60% of the remaining delegates to get a majority going into the convention, and he has to face a series of closed state primaries. Now, North Carolina, in this case, is not a closed state, so you can be unaffiliated and vote in the Republican primary, but he has to face a series of closed state primaries, and he's not won a single state yet that has closed primary. So he faces that. So that's going to be the thing that may lead to the brokered convention.
The flip argument on that is that the math isn't in favor of anyone.
Right.
And Donald Trump so far has probably the best chance, if we go by what we have seen so far, to have the math work out in his favor, simply because he has won the most states. And we are moving forward, starting on March 15th, into a series of winner-take-all primaries. So even with his 40%, if that is his ceiling, with 40% and keeping some other candidates in the race, like Kasich and Rubio especially, and also Cruz, if we see the vote split four ways, 40% is going to do a good bit of damage moving forward.
But yeah, March 5th, our primary date here is very important. It really is, because not only what happens in North Carolina, but in those other states, it's going to be a big day for whether or not Trump is going to be the Republican nominee.
To use Ted's words, I can't be sanguine about this. I think it is highly likely that Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. And I don't anticipate a brokered convention. The critical election coming up is going to be that in the state of Florida. If Rubio loses Florida, it is very likely to be all over, and the latest polls, I've been following them day after day, shows Trump with a very considerable lead in Florida, and the winner-take-all primaries that are about to come after the next couple of weeks could move, and probably will move, very highly in Trump's favor. So I remember I see my friend D.G. Martin here. I remember we were taping a radio broadcast maybe about 3 weeks ago, and I found myself saying in almost these words that I think Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. And I wanted to take the words back because I couldn't believe what I was saying. Because what we've all been saying up to now is, look, Trump's only got a third. But it's hard to imagine a different scenario where either that a different candidate is going to emerge or that we're going to have a brokered convention. Either one is possible, but I think unlikely.
Someone put on a card, another way to ask Professor Leuchtenberg's question is that, have we ever had a major party presidential candidate with no identifiable political ideology who depends almost entirely for political support, not on serious policy proposals, but on his fame, insulting other candidates, and simply insisting that he will do a great job? So I guess if there's anyone that's rose to the top with hype. Well, since my name was mentioned,
yes. I probably ought to not leave the mics silent. You probably have to go back to the campaign of 1840 with a candidate, William Henry Harrison, in the Log Cabin and Cider campaign, who presented an image that was totally absurd. He was presented as the candidate of the people against the patrician Martin Van Buren, when in fact Van Buren was the son of a saloon keeper in the Hudson Valley, and Harrison was a descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence who came from an estate in Virginia. So there have been absurdities, and if one were pressed hard, one might find another example in the past. But I certainly wouldn't dispute the characterization of Trump that was set forth in that question.
Is there any way, I don't know how quick this can be done, but can anyone walk us through the process if a third-party presidential candidate emerges and no one gets, the electoral votes that they need to succeed?
It's very it's a very difficult process because every state electoral votes, at least for the most part, are winner take all. States, of course, you can have defector. You can have defector delegates. You can have some states that apportion by congressional district, but it's really difficult to do when the elections are all first past the post. And that was one of the reasons the Electoral College was designed the way it was the notion was that you would not have regional candidates. You would have a candidate who had the support of the broad swath of the nation to win the Electoral College. Now, if you had a third party, now of course we had the we had the Bull Moose run in 1912, which was the real, I guess, high watermark of that notion in modern times. But Perot came close to winning electoral votes in some western states. Came very close. George H.W. Bush finished third, if I'm not mistaken, in maybe Colorado and perhaps one or other western state. So it's possible that would happen, but it's very difficult the way the system is set up right now for a third party candidate who to come up and do that. Now, an independent run, who knows? A third party candidate can deny the presidency to someone who might otherwise have won it, though. That's the thing. Yeah.
Last question. I don't even know what to ask. I mean, well, since we haven't spoken about them a lot, but someone definitely asked, I guess from the audience, why are evangelicals, Cruz and Rubio, so popular with their views?
So popular with whom?
It says with their views. Probably,
there are a lot of evangelical Americans. I mean, there are a lot of Americans there are evangelicals, though, do not fit any sort of political template at all. There are evangelicals who are very progressive in their views. There are evangelicals who are very conservative in their views. And so, that's just there are Americans who have very, very strongly held religious views of a lot of different perspectives.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up now. I've had a good time. A very smart group of people here tonight.